Welcome to the 38th Annual DeVos Medical Ethics Colloquy. The topics covered in these important dialogues directly impact our interprofessional healthcare partners, those who are still students, and those who are actively serving our community.
It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for tonight, Chris Seide-Givens and Dr. Alex John London.
In machine learning, the subtle difference, although assumptions are still, of course, important, but the focus was much more on the performance of the algorithm against some sort of known ground truth. The first is a lack of transparency around model performance and limitations, which can give us false confidence in the predictions and their use.
So I think there are these major structural problems in the relationship between AI and the development of AI to try to make health systems better. Addressing these issues is going to require that we change the way we carry out medicine and the way we gather data and the way we store data.
The second is allowing ML and AI algorithms to learn biases that exist within our healthcare and health systems.
So I think the myth of cheap learning, that we're going to be able to bolt on machine learning onto current healthcare systems in order to learn things, that was really good at sort of, generating and ginning up excitement, but it's just not going to be a recipe for success.
And the third is a failure to bring models into practice in a kind of safe and timely way.
I think interpretability and explainability, I want us to get medicine to the point that structural engineering is at as much as anybody else. People call that precision medicine.